Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you very much for everyone for coming out this evening and hearing about the injustice of climate change. Many people talk about environmental justice, and many people have been working on it for many years. We decided to change the approach a little bit and talk about climate injustice this evening. But it is my responsibility also to tell people who don't know us a little bit about what we do. So let me do that, and then we will talk a little bit about what the faith community with a capital F wants to do. And I hope that during my remarks, you will be giving some thought to what it is that your faith community may want to do, and even more importantly, what you as an individual may want to do. So who we are, as Jim said, we are a 10-member executive committee, but more importantly, we're a membership organization with 249 faith communities in 100 cities and towns in Massachusetts. We have a 19-member advisory board with scientists, faith leaders, academics, and experts on energy and the environment. We have a dedicated core of volunteers. We are a 501c3 nonprofit and have been doing this since 2002. The two important things about being a 501c3 are you can donate and claim it as a tax deduction, and we cannot endorse or recommend any candidate for political office. What we can do is, and what we do is education and advocacy around public policy issues. We'll talk a little bit about what we have done and more importantly about what we hope to do in the future. So what we do right now in fulfilling our mission, which is a faith-based response to climate change, are education, advocacy, and technical support. For education, we've educated more than 1,400 people on topics ranging from lowering a congregation's carbon footprint to values-based community organizing. We educate on how a congregation can lower its carbon pollution through a half-day workshop called the Show Workshop, Sustainable House of Worship. The next one is coming up this Saturday, October 26th, at St. Joan of Arc in Worcester. And if any of you are interested in that aspect of our work, I hope you can join us. We also send a monthly e-newsletter to 2,200 readers, which talks both about facility energy use and efficiency and solar energy, and about primarily state, but also national energy and climate change events and legislation. Finally, on our website, www.MIPandL.org, we have technical briefs, public policy analyses, and spiritual resources. Advocacy. This has been, for us, primarily a matter of testifying, attending lobbying days, and participating in demonstrations. So when there has been an important issue over the last 10 years, the Clean Power Plan, the Commonwealth's 3-year energy efficiency plan, or carbon pricing legislation, we're there to testify. We also participate in lobby days and in demonstrations. Most recently, in East Boston, in support of the community's efforts there to oppose an NSTAR electrical substation near highly volatile aircraft fuels. Technical support. This is probably what we're best known for. As a result of the help we've given congregations, more than 11,000 metric tons of carbon pollution have been avoided by houses of worship. And you may think that houses of worship are not a big emitter of carbon dioxide, and that's true. But our philosophy has been that they can be visible examples to the community of what should be done, and we hope that once they do take action, they share that word with their congregants and with the community at large. And I know at least my home church, which put a solar PV system up a couple of years ago, many people remark to me that when they see that, they say, this is a church that walks the talk. We've done 336 facility energy audits, including environmental stewardship assessments, which are detailed, extensive reports with recommendations on what a church should do and shouldn't do. So I previously mentioned our Sustainable House of Worship program. This started with the Episcopal Diocese about 6 or 7 years ago. Since that time, we've gotten sponsorship from the American Baptist Churches, the Episcopal Diocese of Western Massachusetts, the United Church of Christ, the United Methodist Church, and this Saturday we're doing our first one in collaboration with the Roman Catholic Church. So this is a very popular program. Many churches come to us and say, yeah, we've done that already. And yet we kind of know from when we do the audits, they've often done something, but there's usually a lot that remains to be done. And when we started this work, we included information that the average house of worship can lower its carbon emissions by 30%. And we asked churches to do better than that. Now we ask houses of worship, churches, synagogues, mosques, to reduce their CO2 by more than 50% with a goal of becoming carbon neutral. And many of our members have done that. The three that come to mind, the Boston Synagogue in the former West End lowered its emissions by 70%. St. Bridget's in Lexington saves $33,000 a year on energy bills. St. Andrews in Wellesley lowered their emissions by 65%, saves in excess of $20,000 a year. So there's a lot to be done there, and we can help you do it. Building a movement. So what we've mainly been doing has been education, advocacy, and technical support. But we are part of an environmental movement. And what we've realized is we haven't done enough to build that movement. We have done a couple of sessions on values-based community organizing. People have liked them very much. This year, we're trying to bring a similar program called Be the Spark from Minnesota. Erin Pratt at the Minnesota MIPandL affiliate is a psychologist, and I've seen her work several times. She does an incredible job of building relationships with people, helping them to value the skills and the gifts that they build, develop them into a plan for their own engagement as community organizers and hopefully as leaders. So we have a lot of sophistication about public policy and technical issues. I'm realizing that one of the real barriers to having more success is psychological resistance to becoming engaged in this kind of work. That's another topic of its own, but it's there. And Erin has a very skillful and kind approach to doing this work, which is very effective. We're in the process of raising funds to bring this program to Massachusetts in the winter. We have very small grant support at this point. We've just mailed requests for support to 140 churches and synagogues. If yours is one of them, and if you're interested in that, I'd be happy to tell you more about Be the Spark. Climate injustice. There are several ways in which climate change is a justice issue. Probably the most obvious is the countries in the northern hemispheres, North America and Europe, emit large amounts of carbon dioxide, and the consequences are felt most heavily in the agricultural areas of the southern hemisphere. This map shows the dark blue areas as the areas which feel the greatest impact. And you can see that those areas are basically sub-Saharan Africa and low-lying areas of Asia. Now, this is a statement from the head of Oxfam in Great Britain that goes back about 15 years. And she says, it's a matter of social justice. If we care about injustice and inequality, we must care about climate change. Climate change exacerbates existing inequalities. And it does more than exacerbate existing inequalities. It can lead to drought, famine, and political instability, and it has. We often say, and it's true, that there are more refugees from climate change than there are from wars. However, the effects of climate change are gradual, sometimes not so gradual, but progress over a period of years, and by the time the political instability occurs, the root causes are often forgotten. But it's not only an international issue, it's an American issue and it's a local issue. Climate change has disproportionate effects on people right here in Massachusetts. 3 times as many African Americans suffer from asthma as whites, and 3 times as many African Americans who are born in the United States suffer from asthma as Africans born in other parts of the world. So this is not a genetic issue. And low-income communities not only are more vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and you may have read about 550 people in the Squanton neighborhood of Quincy who were evacuated in the spring as a result of one of the major storms. Many people whose homes were lost or severely damaged. So we often think of this as affecting coastal communities, which is true, but the other issue is these communities don't have the resources to deal with the problems or to advocate for themselves. Now, in my own community, I don't believe it was a resource problem, but in our community, we opposed the expansion of a high-pressure gas pipeline, and we lost. In other communities, and there's that fight going on right now in Weymouth, they're succeeding, and they probably will succeed. So a community has to understand the problem while there's still time to mobilize political opposition. In my community, we did mobilize that opposition. The mayor opposed it, our congressman opposed it, but it was just too late. Health effects are something that this program will be focusing on, and Gina McCarthy from the Harvard School of Public Health will speak about the health effects on children. There are a couple of dots to connect in this area, but it's really not that complicated. The same substances that cause climate change, the emissions, the byproducts from burning fossil fuels, cause conventional air pollution. And the hotter it is, the worse that air pollution, generally we think of that as ground level ozone or smog, the worse it gets. So the fight to respond to climate change is also a public health fight. The Medical Society Consortium is an organization that has done research on these issues. I'm not going to go into them because I don't want to say anything that may not be up to date, that Gina has better information on, but this is just a quick summary. First health effect of air pollution: fire, smog, pollen, and plus microparticulates. And microparticulates are an issue that has become more and more linked to asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Number 2, extreme weather. This is fairly obvious. We think of people being flooded in homes, having things fall on them. We see from the devastation in Puerto Rico, however, the additional deaths that are caused by people not having access to medication, not having access to visiting nurses, not having access to medical care. So that an initial estimate in Puerto Rico that there were 62 people killed, we now see it's something more like 3,000 to 4,000. Health effect number 3, extreme heat. The most famous example I'm aware of in the United States was in Chicago. A very extreme and protracted heat wave resulted in many deaths, mainly African Americans. Sometimes that's related to the fact that there's no air conditioning, but it doesn't mean that extreme heat is still not the cause. Recently, we see incredibly awful heat waves in Europe, Pakistan, and India, where the heat is exceeding 120 degrees for long periods of time. The example that I remember was on vacation once in the Midwest. A very large swimming pool had water that was 90 degrees, and they were taking trash barrels of ice and dumping it in the pool so the kids could swim. There it was only about 105 degrees for a week, though. You can imagine what it's like going at 120, 130 degrees for weeks. We all have environmental heroes. I think of Rachel Carlson. I think of Bill McKibben. My own environmental hero is kind of a low-profile guy. Some of you may know. His name is Gus Speth. He was one of the founders of the the NRDC, that does a lot of climate litigation. He then was the dean of the Yale School of Forestry, and I'm not sure where Gus is now. But in 2007, he made this statement: "I used to think that the big three were climate, biodiversity, and pollution, but after many years, I think pride, apathy, and greed are even bigger." We need cultural and social transformation, and science doesn't do that. The church does that. And here we can certainly substitute the synagogue or the mosque. So we're not going to talk about Scripture tonight, but I thought I'd take a quick run through 5 major faith statements that have been issued in the last 5 years, just to point out a few things that resonated with me. And in some cases, I wasn't surprised. And in other cases, I thought, gee, that's a little bit of a surprise. And I'd ask you to take a look at them to see what threads run throughout these statements and where these statements are different. I'm taking these in chronological order. In April of 2013, there was something called the Climate Awakening in Copley Square. And I remember that very clearly because Bishop Desmond Tutu was live streamed into Trinity Copley for us. I see Don Tesorero here, who led the procession from South Church over to Trinity Church. So in that statement, it was said, number 1, it is essential that we speak up because climate change is a moral and a justice issue. It also invited the churches to advocate for policies that enable a swift transition from dependence on fossil fuels to clean, safe, and renewable energy, and for economic systems that are fair and just. And then to engage in public witness through advocacy. Public witness, often we think of in faith communities as going to a demonstration, speaking up, but here, and this statement was issued by the national leaders of the American Baptist Church, the Episcopal Church, and the United Church of Christ, and regional leaders of the Greek Orthodox Church, the Presbyterian Church, and the Lutheran Church. They're asking people to exercise public witness through advocacy. Then, of course, the famous Laudato Si on care for our common home. Here, and this surprised me when it came out, Pope Francis said, Christians' responsibility within creation and their duty towards nature and the Creator are an essential part of their faith. And I kind of wondered then, and still do, how many people think that that's the case. So we see justice mentioned prominently. Again, we see a goal: the technology-based use of highly polluting fossil fuels must be progressively replaced without delay. Then a rabbinic letter on the climate crisis. We see similar things, an ancient wisdom that social justice and a healthy earth are combined. The one I like is insist that tax money no longer go to subsidizing enormous profitable big oil, but instead subsidizing the swift deployment of renewable energy as quickly in this emergency as our government made in the emergency of the early 1940s to shift from manufacturing airplanes to tanks. And to me, when people get discouraged about this, I go back and read about the Great Depression, read about Franklin Roosevelt. If you want to read something, read No Ordinary Times and be reminded how bad the economy in the United States, how polarized we were, how at risk capitalism was from imploding, and how quickly, with the proper leadership and the proper mobilization, that changed. The Black church statement is a little different. It says, "We view climate change as a moral issue and one of the greatest public health challenges of our time." We don't see that in the other statements. In Genesis, breath is declared a God-given right, yet almost 40% of the 6 million Americans living in close proximity to coal power plants are people of color. Now, the Interfaith climate change statement, which was issued by about 4,000 representatives of many faiths prior to the Paris Accords. And I think they do the best job, frankly, of hitting the main points. Number one, strive for alternatives to the culture of consumerism that is so destructive. Recognize the importance of phasing out all fossil fuel subsidies and a transition to 100% renewable energies by 2050. Now, we've been working on these issues in Massachusetts, and whenever somebody gives a goal of 100%, I'm like, wow, I don't know if we're going to be able to do that. But this is what the faith leaders of the world said before Paris. Now, the IPCC report that just came out on October 10th. Has anybody seen coverage of that in the papers? Okay, so a lot of people doing this work are saying, wow, this looks bad. People are going to get discouraged. You know, what are we going to do? So I want to just point out that although the news continues to be bad, the goal that's identified in that report, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, is possible within the laws of chemistry and physics, although it would require unprecedented changes. And the goal at the bottom is reaching net zero around 2050. So the goal of the faith community and the goal of the scientific community is the same: zero emissions by 2050. Is that easy? It will not be. We know the technology needed. It's not that expensive to do it, and I know I say that as a fact without time for explanation, but a lot of conservative economists say the same thing. What's missing is the political will. We have to, as a faith community, do a better job of mobilizing to influence the policymakers. So that statement, and I'm rushing through a little bit now because I see my time is almost up, concluded about having hope rooted in faith that the necessary changes will be made. I prefer not to talk about hope in a religious context because many of you have probably heard that it's different from optimism, and we don't have time for a long discussion of that. But Václav Havel, who led Czechoslovakia from communist rule, has an outstanding quote on hope, and it's written, or it's quoted in a book called Hope in the Dark by Rebecca Solnit, who's an activist. And she covers some of the same ground that's covered by Joanna Macy in Active Hope, but it's much more concise, and it's written from an activist's point of view. And if you're discouraged, I would recommend that. He says here, the kind of hope I think about, and especially in situations that are particularly hopeless, I understand as a state of mind, not a state of the world. It's an orientation of the spirit, an orientation of the heart. It transcends the world that's immediately experienced and is achieved somewhere beyond its horizons. Hope, in this deep and powerful sense, is not willingness to invest in an enterprise that is obviously headed for success, but rather an affinity to work for something because it is right. And that's what the church and the faith community can provide. Coincidentally, or perhaps not, 5 days after the IPCC report came out, the Globe, that's kind of been, all over the place on climate change, has come out and said, in an era of climate urgency, we need a carbon tax. I had hoped to tell you the story about how Mass Interfaith Power and Light became involved in the effort in Massachusetts to pass a carbon fee and rebate, not a tax, in Massachusetts, because in the models being considered here, either all of the monies that go for the carbon fee are refunded to the public. But we're out of time. We made that fight for 4 years. We got support from exactly 50% of the House of Representatives last year. So we have to do better in this next session. And if you're interested in that, I'd be happy to talk to you more about it later. So that's who we are. We hope you will consider joining us in covenant with our existing members. Thank you.